Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. And I've got Caleb Walker for you today. And he's got a fascinating story about achieving financial freedom during his time in the military, which I think will be very interesting and inspiring for the guests on the show. A lot of them are doctors and they've gone through education, training, practice, and still unable to achieve financial freedom. So that's why I decided to bring Caleb onto the show. So, Caleb, welcome.
Hey, thanks very much, Christopher, for letting me on the show. Yeah, I think it would be great to talk to people that make a lot of money and how they can actually become financially free quite easily. When I was in the army, there used to be, particularly when I lived out in kind of the middle of the country, the running joke was that nobody could spend money faster than military people and oil workers. And so I've always tried to show that if you're pretty good with your money, you can become financially free and not have to continue working for years and years.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I was hearing about all these wasteful spending on wars, and people were saying like spending like billions on these empty military bases, like seat covers were like 100,000, and all this just such wasteful spending they could be using for. So talk about kind of some of the principles because there's a lot of doctors on the show, and like I said, like some of them struggle like paying high taxes and just these lavish lifestyles and come to the end of their career, they still have to keep working. So talk about what you did.
Yeah, and so well, in the military, a lot of times, so I did 3 tours to Afghanistan. You actually, it's a unknown secret, is that when you deploy overseas, you get a lot of money for danger pay. Sometimes you get tax free, and so young soldiers can typically come into a bit of a windfall after a 6 to 12 month deployment of $50,000 to $80,000 in their 20s. So I guess it's like a doctor would finish medical school. They finally go through all the training and all the different things they have to do to be successful. But then I would assume they start making a lot of money. And there's always two paths with it when you start coming in with a lot of money. There's in between, but the extreme is what would happen is that soldiers would go and do like a 6 to 12 month tour, come into $60,000 to $80,000 in their bank account because of tax free extra money for being overseas, danger pay, all these other benefits. And it's always like the running joke of who has a new truck. And so they would all go in their 20s or early 30s. They'd go buy like a brand new Ford F-150, 250, Raptor, or whatever it's called, or the Tesla, or whatever else. And they would spend it all on what essentially is a giant liability. I chose not to do that. I did my first tour when I was 21, and I used it to help pay off a very small house that I had, which I had a bunch of renters at as well. And then basically that was always what I tried to tell to the young soldiers is that if obviously a lot of investments and assets grow exponentially as you go, and time is you save a lot of money really fast, or you save a little bit of money but over a long period of time. And if they just put in like that $30,000 or $40,000, like half the money that they just banked on in that tour, then it compounds a 7 to 10% over 10, 15, 20 years. And I was pretty deliberate about it because I actually hanged out with a bunch of the older soldiers that were pretty burnt out and didn't enjoy doing what they were doing anymore. And I always asked them, like, why are you still doing this then? Like, particularly as a young guy. And they said that they just didn't have any money. Like they had to keep working to keep up with their lifestyle, and they just had to keep going and going. And I always knew that I didn't want to do that ever. And so as a relatively young guy, I got pretty into real estate, and I built up to a portfolio of about 15 different units. And I can talk through how I did that. But that allowed me to have my own terms at that point. Like I could keep working if I wanted to, but the income from the real estate meant that I didn't have to, which has allowed me actually to become like a technology entrepreneur now, is that I don't have to have an income coming in every month and then chase it. I can actually be a bit more creative and then build up the technology and the solutions that I'm building up right now, which allows me to have a bit more risk, but then a lot more payoff as I go forward. So yeah, that's always what I would tell is if you just bank a little bit of money and early with a lot of time, then when things start becoming not as fun anymore, or you get tired, or you want to try something different, you don't have to work because that's where you're at. And so if you can do that under a relatively small military soldier salary, I can guarantee you could do that underneath a doctor's salary. Does that make sense, for?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. And I did the same thing. It's basically save for a rainy day. And basically, so talk about this. And what's interesting is before you used to hear about like sports and sports athletes and movie stars, but now you're hearing like doctors and lawyers getting into the same kind of trouble, which is a little bit worrisome. And talk about this. And what I really love about you is you said you were very deliberate. So you had this awareness and then you were very intentional, which kind of compounded your success. And then, so here's a very scary statistic. You're in Canada, I'm in USA, our country is going to shit, and we're 34 trillion in debt. And so talk about this idea of inflation, basically the government's stealing away the wealth of and basically transferring it to the super rich. And if you're holding dollars or currency, you're SOL. But if you hold assets such as real estate, so talk about this idea of transferring currency to assets to stay financially ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't. Whatever you know of it, is you obviously want to make sure that you don't just have it sitting in a bank account, because obviously inflation will end up meaning that it becomes worth less and less the longer you're in. And so you want to be pretty deliberate about how you can try and beat the rate of inflation with the different investments. It could be as simple as a S&P 500 to the Vanguard. Yeah, that's what I have a lot of my money in right now. It just grows with the stock market, which is on average between 7 to 10% over 100 years. Or you have to put a bit of a sweat equity into maybe owning some properties. And so, yeah, you definitely, yeah, you want to make sure that you do that. I have a funny story actually about that. My wife had about $20,000 early in her life in a mutual fund that she had been sold to basically by a bank. And one day, I don't know, like 8 years into our marriage, she like looked at my portfolio, and I had started with the same amount of money. I obviously had put more into it, but it had about an 8 to 10 and compounded interest over the decade. While hers had not really grown at all, because even if it had grown by 3 or 4%, the management fees had reduced that to nothing. And so she basically still had the same amount of money, like $20,000 in her bank account, like 8 years later. But because I had just bought some assets as like with ETFs that are don't charge me any money to have them in there, and they're just following the general stock market and my properties. But my money had more than doubled at that time. Yeah, that would be the concern of just like keeping money in a bank that's not doing anything for you. Is that like in 10 years, it's going to be worth less money. So, and then I had the perfect example of my own family to answer your question there, Christopher.
Yeah, it's really a great point because basically my wife and I, we have a safe and stable, and then we also, and for example, like these sometimes these employer sponsor plan, you don't have much choice. So you have to go into these high fee funds and you look at, but then we like go into other kind of funds that have a little bit higher return and you can actually chart the course, same amount over 10, 20 years minus that fee. It's actually really incredible. Here's another question I have for you because mutual funds are really dinosaurs. Like I don't see why people invest in those. And then but now you have like ETFs. And I was also thinking the other day, real estate's a great way. A lot of the ultra wealthy, they invest in real estate. But if you look at the returns on real estate, it's not, and then the amount of people say it's like passive income. It's not really passive income because you got sweat equity and you got to deal with tenants and insurance, and now you have to deal with climate change and earthquakes and all these stuff. Is real estate, are there any like better investments in terms of like hard assets that preserve your power that aren't as tedious as real estate?
Oof. Yeah, I would agree. Real estate is the way to make money on real estate is to leverage yourself. So obviously, if you only own 20% or 25% of the property, then maybe the house or the property will only increase in value 3%. So if it's $100,000 house, it's worth $103,000 next year. But if you're leveraging yourself, and so therefore you're only putting like $25,000 down on that $100,000 house, 25%, then it's actually a larger return than 3%. Plus you're paying it down. So then that's all like the little margins that you make more and more money on real estate, which I can go into how I was able to like build pretty fast. But yeah, but as you have stated, it's pretty tough sometimes to make money on it. I am a big fan. If you don't need the money right away, which you've explained it between your two different systems, like a high growth and a stable. Like if you're going to put money into assets, into the stock market, in an ETF, and you might need that in 6 months, then that's obviously the risk of the growth is that in 6 months it might go down 7%. So then you're going to be kicking yourself. So you really have to make sure that you're purchasing the right product at the right time. But yeah, I don't think you can beat the Vanguard ETF, not to shout them out too much, which grows based on how the stock market goes. And if you're willing to have it in there for a long period of time, then that's going to give you great returns, which is way less work and way less problems than real estate. Yeah, that's where the value of real estate is. I actually bought one of my first property. It was a triplex with basically whatever money I had from multiple tours in my late 20s. And then I was able to use some of the equity because I fixed it up to buy my second place. And then I was able to buy a third place because it was like like basically the previous owner, he had to get rid of the place quite quickly for him to move into the place he already purchased. So he gave it to me with no money down. I just assumed the mortgage. And so once you keep going and going, you can build your portfolio quite big. The problem with real estate, though, is like the real way to make money and returns is by having leverage and leveraging yourself, which becomes like a very stressful lifestyle. So if you don't want to so if you're willing to have a stressful lifestyle and have to put some sweat equity into it and have to really maybe even sometimes work the real estate, then you can get some good returns off of it. And real estate could be great. You could get like higher than 10%, could even be like 20% returns. But if you just want to be a bit more relaxed about it, I don't think you can go wrong with just an ETF, Vanguard ETF. No stress really, and it just sits there and you don't have to really follow up on it. So I guess, does that answer your question there, Christopher?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's like this idea because like my first two or three properties, it was great because like I was actually learning but now like I'm more established, it's like I have to, a lot of that time wasted on dealing with all these issues they're really a pain in the ass. Can that time be better spent on other high value things versus, and I know actually people like a couple of my colleagues, they just buy these um real estate, like these very expensive real estate, but they don't rent it out, they just keep it and they just write it off, and it's like an appreciating asset, and it's a hard asset. It's almost like owning a painting or something another, and then they don't have to worry about people damaging it, and they got insurance, very similar to owning like an ETF, but it's like an actual hard asset. So really interesting. Yeah, I think if you're starting out, landlord may not be the best use of your time as if you're a doctor, but it's good to learn the business. And then eventually you have to find other ways for which you talked about. Yeah. And it's not liquid. Like you have to fill out all these forms and apply for loans and to refinance all this stuff. It's like really, they really hang. It's not, and it's very illiquid, but
if you buy a good place and it's making great money, then you're laughing because you probably don't want to sell it anyway. If you buy, I had to sell one place. If you buy a place that you don't like and it's costing you money, and you want to try and get rid of that place, then you're stuck. And then you are not liquid. You're hoping that someone buys it. And I've been in that situation before where once you sell it, you're just like, thank goodness, I don't have to deal with that anymore. But it gave me some stability. So now that I can, like, obviously the biggest money you can make typically is if you invest in yourself. And so then if you can run your own business and you can build out a business with some income, then that's how you make the most money. And that's what I'm doing right now. I've worked in like kind of digital companies beforehand, but what I'm doing right now is I'm helping build out communities using a digital software platform that I use, and it helps collaborate and connect people across large organizations or communities. And it's really, if you're part of a community and you want to talk to someone else, like you don't know who to talk to. I guess the biggest example would be if you went to an event and there's like 3,000 people, like who are you supposed to talk to at that event? Like who's the right person to talk to? And that's the problem that I'm trying to solve, and I am solving with a variety of customers. And when you invest in yourself, obviously you can make the most money, which I'm sure most of the doctors know that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, it just I've got all these things like all these interesting stories. But how can people contact you and follow you? And because you obviously have a sound financial education and knowledge, and a lot of the audience may want to reach out to you and follow you.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. It's just Caleb Walker, or you can send me an email at caleb@thedigitaluncertainty.com. Particularly if you are interested in helping build out better communication in large organizations like a large hospital, I can definitely help you do that. Or if you want to build out your own community of doctors that have the right people talking to the right people through an automated AI solution, you can reach out to me as well.
Yeah, awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation and connecting with like minds. And for all the audience, be sure to give Caleb's a socials a like and follow, reach out to him. He's really a great podcast guest. Just starting, and with that, thanks so much for coming on.